Now, what did Reagan mean? How could Reagan believe that a philosophy that Santorum thinks has nothing to do with conservatism, how can it still be the heart and soul of the conservative movement? Well, if you apply Reagan's own philosophy to recent history, that question becomes answered immediately. Reagan believed that conservatism was a three-legged stool consisting of national security conservatives, religious conservatives, and economic/libertarian conservatives. Reagan believed if any of these elements didn't exist, then conservatism would not exist. That is Reagan's definition. The last time Republicans were in power, the national security conservatives were represented well. President George W. Bush's Iraq War was a testament to their success. Religious conservatives were represented well when issues like gay marriage became front and center during the 2004 campaign. But what kind of conservatism, if you can even call it that, allowed a Republican president to spend more money and grow more government than any president in history at that date? What kind? A conservatism that was completely void of the libertarian element that Ronald Reagan deemed essential. This was the conservatism of Medicare Plan D and No Child Left Behind and the Iraq War and executive power and TARP and the bailouts and spying on citizens. This was the conservatism of Rick Santorum. This was the conservatism of Senator John McCain, who said proudly in 2002 that he was glad the Republican Party was getting away from what he called leave us alone libertarian philosophy. Senator McCain said later that he was proud that George W. Bush got away from libertarian orthodoxy and instead replaced it with compassionate conservatism. Now, there are still plenty of Republicans or conservatives who think Bush got it right and that big government is no problem so long as it is under a Republican brand. But there are many more who agree with Senator DeMint that to truly be the conservative party, the GOP must begin to adopt liberty ideas. There are many more willing to revisit what Reagan called the heart and soul of conservative philosophy. For those that essentially agree with DeMint and Reagan, this is no longer a question of whether Ron Paul and his ideas belong in the conservative movement. It instead becomes a statement of fact. Ron Paul and his ideas are the conservative movement. Complaining about the Democrats is not enough. Right-wing grievances about where the First Lady takes her vacations or talking about Barack Obama eating dog is not a political philosophy. Simply hating the other side is not an ideology. It's partisanship, it's childish, and it's useless. To truly limit government, uphold the Constitution, and protect our individual freedoms, conservatives must advance a positive agenda of liberty, not as mere rhetoric, not as a campaign tool, not as a bumper sticker slogan, but a practical philosophy with a real chance of becoming tangible reality. A half-century ago, Barry Goldwater taught us that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Ron Paul listened. To those who didn't listen, I say this. You can certainly be a libertarian without being a conservative. But you cannot be a conservative without also, to some degree, being a libertarian. If shrinking government is the goal, it is ideologically impossible. And if you don't believe me, go take a look at Rick Santorum's voting record. Every major conservative figure of the 20th century, from Goldwater to Reagan to Hayek to Milton Friedman to Bill Buckley, you name it, identified strongly with conservatism's libertarian roots. Even the rare exceptions, like conservative icon Russell Kirk, who had famous disagreements with libertarian icon Murray Rothbard in the 1950s and 60s, held views on foreign policy that today would be considered libertarian lunacy by the war hawks in both parties. In 1994, just a year before his death, Russell Kirk declared, "So far as libertarians set their faces against a policy of American domination worldwide, why, I am with them." Russell Kirk was credited by everyone from Reagan to Buckley for popularizing the term conservative in the United States. Now, a lot of people say, I like Ron Paul, except on foreign policy. It should always be remembered that the man most responsible for American right-wingers even calling themselves conservatives for his entire life agreed the most with libertarians on foreign policy. Now, many conservatives remain unaware of this history. Those who fear Ron Paul in this movement would probably prefer that we all stay unaware of this history. But they are failing. Conservatism's libertarian roots are now back and in full force. You see, none of this was supposed to happen. Ron Paul was supposed to run for president in 2008, maybe get a little attention, and then fade into obscurity. Instead, Ron Paul became a household name. Dr. Paul awakened millions of Americans and cured the apathy of countless Americans who saw politics as just a dead end, but liberty as a way out. Senator Rand Paul was not supposed to happen. Congressman Justin Amash was not supposed to happen. The many people running for House and Senate races this year and who will win those races promoting liberty was not supposed to happen. The many candidates running at the state and local level on liberty platforms and who will win those races was not supposed to happen. 2 million Americans voted for Ron Paul this year. That was doubling his success from 2008. More important, the ideas of Ron Paul, which were held at arm's length by the Republican Party in 2008, are now front and center in our politics. Everything from audit the Fed to audit the Pentagon. It is Ron Paul's revolution that continues to shape our political discourse more than any other movement on the political scene today. What we are trying to do with this movement is more important than this particular election or even Ron Paul, something Dr. Paul would readily admit himself. We are trying to make constitutional government a reality in our time. We're trying to turn the Republican Party into the limited government party it has always purported to be. We're trying to make the conservative movement conservative again. Now, many in the Republican establishment continue to dismiss us as just a bunch of Ron Paul kids, as if the massive youth that Dr. Paul enjoys somehow means we are not serious. Well, this is not the first time the Republican establishment has made that mistake. Consider the following from a 1960 editorial in National Review describing the youth presence for Barry Goldwater at the Republican National Convention that year. Now pay close attention. This is 1960, the Republican Convention, National Review. Youth was everywhere at the Republican convention. Youth managed the various candidates' booths. Youth waved the posters. Youth held the convention parade, and it was youth primarily that staged the presidential demonstration Wednesday night. Lots of the young people had no ideological interest. They'd come, well, because their family was Republican. But those who were serious, the ones who will be working hardest to guide the Republican Party in the future, were conservatives, and most of them Goldwater fans. They passed out 15,000 Goldwater buttons, handed out literature, rallied inside and outside the amphitheater. They greeted Richard Nixon at the airport with Goldwater signs and did the same thing for President Eisenhower the next day. Sound familiar? The National Review editorial then noted, quote, "They drove one Nixon aide into muttering in exasperation, 'Those damn Goldwater people are everywhere.'" The editorial then concluded of these Goldwater youth that these fiery young conservatives and libertarians represent, quote, "those who are serious, the ones who will be working the hardest to guide the Republican Party in the future." Now, of course, National Review in 1960 was right. Those Goldwater kids became the modern American conservative movement. And it is those Ron Paul kids and those Ron Paul people who are picking up where Barry Goldwater left off, who are reviving the philosophy of liberty and championing the constitutional principles of our founders that made this country great.